but I say, hey everyone, Tetris. We all know it, yeah? Maybe some of you grew up with it, or some people are trying to get a high score in Tetris, or like me, I'm trying to be as good as my mother here. And also Tetris was available for many platforms, like the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Nintendo DS, and the current console like the Switch also has a fork of Tetris on it, and also the Game Boy had Tetris available. But maybe you are seeing it in the title that Tetris was nearly impossible to make sync for the Game Boy here. And I do mean it at a hardware level here. And also Nintendo was also a little bit, yeah, how can I say it? I would say a little bit arrogant with their pack-in game for the Game Boy. Well, Miyamoto did wanted to pack in the game Super Mario Land because Mario was and still is the strongest mark from Nintendo. But Tetris made much more sense because it did call out everyone to play this game. Hey, that's even when we are loading up a car here, we in my family we say every time, well, then we have to play a little bit of Tetris here. Or my father here, he says that he is doing some car Tetris in his company. And if Nintendo didn't release Tetris included for the Game Boy, well, probably the Game Boy wouldn't be a success here. But it was quite a challenge to put Tetris on the Game Boy. But before we look at that, we need to address the hardware that is inside the Game Boy here. The Game Boy did release in Europe at September 28, 1990, and here in Germany it has cost around 169 mark here. But that would be around 89 euros here. The Game Boy had a 8-bit processor inside it, which was clocked at about 4.19 MHz. And this processor was based on the Zilog Z80 processor, a very popular CPU at the time. To go aside, there's 8 KB of RAM and also 8 KB of video memory. And the screen is also impressive. It has a resolution of 160 by 144 pixels with 4 shades of grey. But while we are talking display, there were also sprites available. And those can either be 8 by 8 pixels big or 8 by 16 pixels big, but the maximum amount of sprites would be limited to 40 sprites. Yes, but 40 sprites are the limit for it, but in every row there are only 10 sprites visible. And these sprites are graphics objects that can be laid on top of the background, and they can move pretty freely. You can almost compare it like the mouse cursor on modern systems. For an example here. Okay, now we all know what hardware we are dealing with it in here. And well, for Tetris there were a lot of things that made it not sync for the Game Boy here. There was no real physics engine inside it. There was pretty low memory inside it, and get that, the Game Boy can't produce random numbers. Because when Tetris is something that makes you angry, then that you are getting a random block that you are absolutely not needing at the moment. But that happened to me pretty often, yeah, when I play Tetris, that I'm getting a block that I'm absolutely not needing, and then my entire playfield is ruined. And well, was there a solution to all these problems? Well, there were solutions for it, but it needed a pretty good talent at programming and to get every bit out the Game Boy in the performance here. But well, let's quick look at the physics engine of the Game Boy here. In Tetris the blocks are falling down, as we all know, but the Game Boy can't calculate gravity. It can only calculate some numbers. This was then simply solved by counting the frames and moving the block down one cell after the frame was counted. And well, what about the collision here? That was also solved quite easily. And before each movement update, a check is made to see if there is already a block below the block. Or if the line is full, it is deleted and the blocks above them can move up. Okay, that solves the physics problem here. But what about the memory? Well, the RAM on the Game Boy wasn't really a problem, but there were the cartridges that were the problem. Initially, the Game Boy cartridges can only hold 32 kilobytes, and Tetris originally came out with the Game Boy. And later there were cartridges that could even hold 1 megabyte through memory banking, and this memory banking was used on like the Pokemon series, where the memory banking was used to get 1 megabyte. But let's just say we only have 32 kilobytes available. And this was also solved quite easily. The blocks weren't stored in all directions, but only once. And then they simply rotated the blocks either 90, 180 or 270 degrees. Yes, I know, this is obvious, yeah, but this method saved up 75% of the memory. Okay, then we solved the physics problem and the memory problem. But what about the random numbers here? That's the feature that would have made everything else useless. Well, modern consoles and PCs can do this without any problems. But not the Game Boy. It can only handle math and memory values here. So a trick was needed here too. And they created an algorithm that could then generate pseudo-random numbers. Basically, a memory value was taken and combined with a math formula that then generated a number. And to do this, player input and the previously placed blocks were included in the calculation to generate a random number. The game then stored which number ranges each block should appear in. And voila, it worked! It worked, but there were a few hiccups here. Either a block might appear more frequently than others, multiple rounds might be required for random sequences, or the pattern might get influenced by fast or slow players. Or after a reset, the same block sequence might appear again because the algorithm hadn't changed each value yet. And then it was complete. Tetris for the Game Boy. Tetris on the Game Boy might have been unfair, and that wasn't due to bad luck, but rather to the way the Game Boy generated random numbers. A simple algorithm decided which block you got, and that could sometimes go wrong. And to this date, the Game Boy has sold over 118 million units. And Tetris for the Game Boy was sold 35 million times, which made Tetris the most successful game for the Game Boy. But tell me, have you guessed that quite a simple game like Tetris was nearly impossible for the Game Boy? Oh well, personally I really find it fascinating that such a simple game was really impossible to make for the Game Boy here. Otherwise, if I forgot something here, well, I can still make a short video about it. And if you don't want to miss out this or other videos like this, leave a subscribe down there so you can catch up these videos. But then, there's nothing standing here in my script here. That means that was it for me, and then I can say, we see us in the next video.